10 minutes before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, my maid of honor pressed her back against the heavy oak door of the bridal suite, her face the color of unbaked flour. She wasn't holding my bouquet. She was holding her phone like it was a live grenade. She looked at me, her eyes darting to the lace of my sleeves and then back to my face, and she said 3 words that felt like a physical blow to my chest: "Don't go out there." I remember the silence of that room. It was thick, smelling of expensive lilies and the metallic tang of hairspray. I didn't ask her why. Somewhere deep in the marrow of my bones, I think I already knew that the peace I'd felt for the last 6 months was a house of cards, and the wind had finally arrived. I moved to the door, my heels clicking like a countdown on the hardwood, and I eased it open just a fraction of an inch. I didn't see a wedding. I saw an ambush. My entire family. The people who were supposed to be sitting in the front pews with tears of joy were already standing at the altar. They hadn't waited for the processional. My mother was center stage, clutching a wireless microphone like a scepter. My father stood beside her, eyes fixed on a crumpled sheet of yellow paper, his shoulders hunched as if he were bracing for an impact. And then there was my sister, Mia. She had her professional-grade camera rig raised, the red recording light pulsing like a heartbeat in the dim light of the chapel. They weren't waiting for a bride, they were waiting for a victim. What they did next was designed to strip me of my dignity, my future, and the man I loved. It was supposed to be the day I was broken in front of everyone we knew. But they forgot one thing: I spent 32 years learning how to survive them. They thought they were the directors of this drama, but they didn't realize I'd already seen the script. Welcome to the story of how my wedding turned into a courtroom, and how the price tag my mother put on my life ended up costing her everything. I grew up in a house where love wasn't a feeling, it was a transaction. We lived in a respectable suburb of Seattle, the kind of place where the lawns are perfectly manicured to hide the rot inside the walls. My father was a quiet man, a civil servant who spent 30 years avoiding eye contact with his own life. My mother, Sarah, was the opposite. She ran our household like a small-town political machine. Everything was about the narrative. If we looked happy in the Christmas card, we were happy, regardless of the fact that she'd spent 3 hours screaming at us about the color of our sweaters before the photo was taken. When my sister Mia was born, 5 years after me, the air in the house changed. I stopped being a child and became a utility. At 14, I wasn't going to football games. I was the one simmering the gravy for Thanksgiving because Sarah was too overwhelmed. I was the one who spent my Tuesday nights in the back of a humid van, doing my homework by the glow of the dome light while I waited for my grandmother to finish her dialysis treatments because Sarah just couldn't handle the sight of hospitals. Sarah had a phrase she used like a holy hymn, a sentence that functioned as both a command and a cage: "You're the big sister, Elena. You set the example." It took me decades to realize that setting the example was just code for absorbing the blows. I was the shock absorber for the family's dysfunction. If Mia failed a class, it was because I hadn't tutored her enough. If the house was messy, it was because I was being selfish with my time. I learned to move silently, to anticipate my mother's moods before she even entered a room, and to never, ever ask for anything in return. I paid for my own way through university, working double shifts at a diner where the grease seemed to sink into my pores. I didn't get a congratulations on my graduation day from the University of Washington. I got a reminder that since I was now a degreed professional, I could finally start contributing more to Mia's creative fund. Today, I am a senior litigation paralegal at one of the top family law firms in the city. My daily life is a revolving door of high-stakes drama, custody battles, asset division, and protection orders. I spend 8 hours a day looking at the wreckage of perfect families, sorting through the lies they tell each other to win a few extra dollars or a bit more spite. I am an expert in discovery. I know how to find the hidden bank account, the deleted text, and the secret life. I bought my own townhouse 3 years ago, a place where every stick of furniture was paid for with my own sweat, a place where I owe no one a single cent of my soul. But in my family, independence isn't a virtue. It's a threat. In Sarah's eyes, my success didn't mean I was doing well, it meant I was an untapped resource. I was the one expected to host the holidays, the one expected to help out when Mia's influencer career hit another inevitable snag, and the one expected to stay silent when Sarah reminded me for the 1000th time about everything she'd sacrificed to raise me. My mother's favorite weapon was guilt, and she was a master marksman. She didn't need to yell. She just needed to sigh. She just needed to look at me with that performative exhaustion and say, "After everything I've done for this family, I thought I could count on you." It was a cycle I thought I would never break. I told myself it was normal. I told myself that every eldest daughter carries the weight of the world until her back cracks. And then, 3 years ago, the weight shifted. I met Leo. Leo wasn't a fixer or a project. He was a structural engineer, a man who built things to last, who understood that a foundation only holds if it's balanced. He was the first person who looked at me and didn't ask what I could do for him. He just asked how I was. The first time I brought him home for dinner, the air in my parents' dining room went cold enough to see your breath. Leo was everything my mother hated. He was self-assured, he was quiet, and he saw right through her. He brought a bouquet of sunflowers and a bottle of fine wine, shaking my father's hand with a grip that said he wasn't afraid. Sarah's smile didn't reach her eyes. She sat at the head of the table, her gaze flitting between Leo's pressed shirt and the way he reached over to squeeze my hand under the table. She didn't ask him about his career or his life. She simply looked at me and said 2 words that felt like a death sentence: "He's interesting." After dinner, while Leo was in the kitchen helping my father with the dishes, the first time a man had ever helped my father do anything in that house, Sarah pulled me into the hallway. The shadows from the overhead light made her face look like a mask of concern. "Are you sure about this, Elena?" She whispered, her voice dripping with fake, honeyed pity. "You've worked so hard. You've built such a life. You could do so much better than someone so pedestrian." She didn't say what she really meant. She never does. What she meant was, "He's taking you away from my control. He's teaching you that you have value outside of what you provide for me. And I cannot allow that." As I walked back into the kitchen, I saw Mia leaning against the counter, filming a day in the life reel. She glanced at Leo, then at me, and let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "He's not exactly what I imagined for the big sister role, kind of a downgrade, don't you think?" I didn't argue. I didn't defend him. I just took Leo's hand and left. I thought that by creating distance, I was creating safety. I started skipping Sunday dinners. I stopped answering the 3-a-day phone calls that were always just a list of errands Sarah needed me to run. I thought I was finally building a wall between my new life and their old demands. What I didn't know was that while I was building a wall, my mother was digging a tunnel. She wasn't going to let her dependable daughter walk away without a fight. She had been making plans, real plans, that involved more than just snide comments. She had been talking to people. She had been looking at guest lists. And she had been waiting for the moment when I would be at my most vulnerable. The next 4 years were a masterclass in subtle sabotage. Every holiday, every birthday, every milestone was tainted by a small, calculated act of exclusion. Year 1. Sarah forgot to set a place for Leo at Christmas, claiming she thought it was just immediate family. Year 2, she threw a garden party specifically to introduce me to the son of an old friend, a man named Julian who was as vapid as he was wealthy, while Leo stood 5 feet away holding a plate of appetizers. Year 3, Sarah stopped using Leo's name entirely. He became your friend or the engineer. She was trying to wear me down, waiting for the crack in the foundation. But Leo never wavered. On the drives home from those suffocating visits, he would hold my hand and say nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was his strength. But I could see the toll it was taking. I could see the way he exhaled when we finally pulled into our own driveway, the way he shook off the psychic film of my family's house. "They don't have to like me, he told me once, his voice steady. "They just have to respect that you've chosen me." But Sarah didn't respect choices. She only respected ownership. And by the time the wedding was 6 months away, she had decided that if she couldn't break us apart with words, she would buy the outcome she wanted. I didn't know about the bank transfers. I didn't know about the late-night meetings with Julian's mother. I didn't know that my own mother had calculated the exact dollar amount she thought my happiness was worth. I was so blinded by the excitement of planning my future that I didn't notice the shadows moving in the background. I didn't notice that Sarah had suddenly become supportive, offering a massive financial contribution that seemed too good to be true. I wanted to believe she had finally changed. I wanted to believe that for once, the big sister was being taken care of. I should have known better. In my family, nothing is a gift. Everything is a hook. And as the date approached, I began to realize that the guest list Sarah was so meticulously helping me with wasn't a list of friends. It was an audience for the execution she had planned. The week before the wedding, the air felt electric, the kind of stillness that precedes a devastating storm. I was sitting in my office, surrounded by trial binders, when a notification popped up on my personal phone. It was a message from a number I didn't recognize, but the attachment made my heart stop. It was a grainy photo of a handwritten ledger, dated months ago. I stared at the names. I stared at the numbers. And then I saw the memo written in my mother's unmistakable, elegant cursive. I felt the floor drop out from under my chair. The heart hit didn't happen at the altar, it happened right there, in the silence of my office, as I realized that the woman who gave me life had just sold it to the highest bidder. I looked at the clock. The rehearsal was in 4 hours. I had two choices: I could run, or I could do what I do best. I could start discovery. I closed the ledger and picked up my desk phone. "Get me the records on Julian Whitmore," I told my assistant, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. Everything. Bankruptcies, litigations, social media history. I want to know who my mother thinks is worth $40,000. The investigation didn't take long. When you spend your life sorting through the wreckage of other people's secrets, you develop a sixth sense for where the bodies are buried. While Leo was at the hardware store, picking up supplies for our new home, I sat in the blue light of my laptop, watching the digital ghost of my mother's betrayal take shape. I wasn't just looking for Julian Whitmore, I was looking for the string that tied him to Sarah. I found it in the most public place imaginable. The public Venmo feed of Julian's mother, Carol. There they were. 2 massive transfers. The first for $25,000, the second for $15,000. The memos weren't even clever. They didn't say happy birthday or investment. They said wedding arrangement. I felt a coldness settle over me that I can only describe as a kind of clarity. My mother hadn't just been suggesting I could do better. She had actively brokered a deal. Carol Whitmore wanted her son, a man with a history of failed ventures and a reputation for being a charming disaster, to marry someone stable. Someone dependable. Someone who could manage his chaos the way I had managed my mother's for 3 decades. And Sarah? Sarah wanted the money, but more than that, she wanted a son-in-law she could control. Leo was an engineer, he understood load-bearing walls. Julian was a hollow shell. He would have let Sarah run our lives as long as the checks kept clearing. I didn't scream. I didn't throw my laptop. I simply opened a new folder on my desktop and labeled it Exhibit A. I spent the next 4 hours pulling Julian's actual history: 3 startup bankruptcies, a reckless driving charge that had been quietly settled, and a trail of disgruntled former partners. This was the man my mother thought was an upgrade. When Leo finally walked through the door, his hair messy and his hands covered in sawdust, he found me sitting in the dark. I didn't say a word. I just turned the screen toward him. I watched his eyes track the numbers, then the names, and finally the memos. I expected him to be angry. I expected him to tell me to call the whole thing off. Instead, he pulled out the chair next to me, sat down, and looked at the screen with the clinical detachment of a man inspecting a bridge for structural failure. "She's turned our wedding into a hostile takeover," he said quietly. "She thinks she's already won," I replied. "She thinks that because she's paying for the venue and the flowers with Carol's money, I'm obligated to follow the script she's writing." Leo looked at me, his eyes dark and steady. We aren't canceling, Elle. If we cancel, she just tells everyone we were unstable and she looks like the grieving mother who tried to save her daughter. We let her play her hand. But we're going to change the deck. That night, we sat at the kitchen table until 2 a.m, not as a bride and groom, but as a legal team. We mapped out the next 72 hours. We wouldn't confront her. We wouldn't give her the satisfaction of a pre-wedding blowout that she could use to paint me as hysterical. We would be perfect. We would be grateful. We would let her walk right into the trap she had set for us. The rehearsal dinner was the first real test. It was held at a waterfront bistro, all white linen and flickering candles, the kind of place Sarah loved because it looked expensive in photos. She was in her element, floating from table to table like a queen dowager, her hand resting frequently on Carol Whitmore's shoulder. Julian was there, of course. He sat directly across from me, wearing a navy blazer and a smile that felt like it had been practiced in a mirror. He kept trying to catch my eye, offering friendly anecdotes about his latest tech venture. Every time he spoke, I could see Sarah watching me, her eyes darting back and forth, waiting for me to show a sign of interest. Elena looks so tired, Sarah remarked to the table, her voice loud enough to silence the surrounding conversations. The stress of the wedding is clearly getting to her. It's a good thing Carol and I have been handling the heavy lifting, isn't it? She was setting the stage. She was telling the guests, the audience, that I was fragile. That I was incapable. That I was a bride who needed rescuing. I looked at Leo. He was mid-conversation with my father, discussing the mechanics of a local bridge project. He didn't look up, but he shifted his foot slightly, his shoe pressing against mine under the table. A silent signal. Stay steady. I'm not tired, Mom, I said, my voice as smooth as glass. I'm just focused. There's a lot coming to light this week that I didn't expect. It's been enlightening. Sarah's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Well, weddings always bring out the truth, don't they? They certainly do, I replied, raising my glass toward Carol. To the truth. May it be revealed in full. The table toasted. Carol looked confused, Sarah looked suspicious. But they both drank. As the plates were cleared, Sarah stood up to give a preview toast. She didn't mention Leo's name once. She talked about Elena's journey, about the importance of making the right choices for the long term, and about the deep bonds between our two families, gesturing toward the Whitmores. I looked over at Mia, my sister. She was filming the whole thing, her phone held high. She caught my gaze and smirked, a look that said, "You're finally getting what's coming to you." Mia had always been the backup singer in my mother's choir, and she was clearly enjoying the lead-up to the grand finale. When the dinner ended, Sarah pulled me aside near the coat rack. She smelled of white wine and expensive perfume. "Tomorrow is going to be a very big day, Elena," she whispered, her grip on my arm uncomfortably tight. "I've arranged for your father to say a few words before the vows. A little surprise. Just make sure you listen. Really listen." "I wouldn't miss a word of it, Mom," I said. I drove home in silence. The Discovery binder was already in Leo's car, tucked under the spare tire. It contained the Venmo printouts, the bank records I'd managed to verify through a contact in forensic accounting, and a side-by-side comparison of the guest list I had authorized versus the ones Sarah had actually sent to the caterer. She had added 40 people, all of them Whitmore associates, business partners, and social climbers. She wasn't just throwing a wedding, she was hosting a merger. The morning of the wedding was gray and heavy with the threat of rain. I woke up at 5 a.m, staring at the ceiling of our townhouse. In 5 hours, I would be at the venue. In 6 hours, Sarah would attempt her intervention. I moved through the morning like a ghost. I showered, I drank black coffee, and I packed my evidence clutch, a small, white satin bag that held more than just lipstick and tissues. It held the keys to my mother's undoing. When I arrived at the bridal suite, the atmosphere was a manic swirl of tulle and champagne. My bridesmaids were laughing, the hairstylist was clicking her curling iron, and the room was filled with the scent of lilies. But every time the door opened, I felt a jolt of adrenaline. At 10 o'clock, Sarah walked in. She was wearing a champagne-colored silk dress that almost matched the bridesmaid's dusty rose. A subtle way of asserting she was part of the bridal party, not just the mother. She was carrying a thick, cream-colored envelope. "For you, Elena," she said, setting it on the vanity. I wrote down some thoughts. "I want you to read it before you go out there. It's important." I looked at the envelope. I knew what was in it. It would be a list of Leo's failings, a desperate plea for me to see sense, and perhaps a final nudge toward Julian. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. "Thanks, Mom," I said, my voice flat. She lingered for a moment, her eyes scanning my face, looking for the cracks she had worked so hard to create. "You look different today," she noted. "Is everything okay?" "Everything is perfect," I said, turning to the mirror. "I've never been more sure of what I'm about to do." She nodded, satisfied, and left the room. 5 minutes later, my maid of honor, Rachel, slipped inside and locked the door. She looked like she had seen a ghost. She pulled her phone out and showed me a text from a friend who was already seated in the garden. "The groom is here, but the vibe is weird. Your dad is at the altar with a microphone and a stack of papers. Sarah is standing next to him like she's about to give a State of the Union address. And Julian Whitmore is sitting in the third row, right next to the aisle. What is happening?" I looked at Rachel. I looked at the white satin clutch on the table. The hard hit was coming. Sarah wasn't going to wait for the reception to make her move. She was going to do it right there, at the altar, before the vows were even exchanged. She was going to humiliate Leo in front of everyone he respected and offer me a way out with Julian, right there on the grass. I stood up, the lace of my dress whispering against the floor. I didn't feel like a bride. I felt like a litigator walking into the most important deposition of my career. "Rachel," I said, my voice cold and steady. "Do you have the waterproof mascara?" "Yeah," she whispered. "Why?" "Because," I said, reaching for my clutch. "My mother is about to learn that you can't buy a person who has already found their own worth. But before I walk out that door, there's one thing I need you to do." I handed her a small, sealed manila envelope. "If I don't make it to the second I do, I need you to make sure the DJ plays the audio file on this thumb drive. Don't ask questions. Just wait for my signal." Rachel took the envelope, her hands shaking. "What's on the drive, Elle?" I looked at the door, where the muffled sound of the string quartet was beginning to play the first notes of the processional. "The sound of a $40,000 mistake," I said. As I stepped toward the door, I saw my father through the window. He was standing at the altar, looking at the yellow paper Sarah had forced into his hand. He looked small. He looked broken. And then I saw Julian. He was leaning forward in his seat, adjusted his tie, and looked at his watch as if he were waiting for a train. I took a breath, gripped my bouquet, and nodded to the coordinator. The doors swung open, the light hit the white stone path, and I saw Leo. He was standing at the far end of the aisle, his face a mask of calm. But as I took the first step, I noticed something that hadn't been there during the rehearsal. There were 2 extra chairs at the altar, directly behind my mother. And sitting in them were 2 men in dark suits I didn't recognize, men who looked less like wedding guests and more like process servers. Sarah hadn't just planned an intervention. She had brought reinforcements. The walk down the aisle is supposed to feel like a beginning, but for me, it felt like a tactical approach. Every step I took on that white stone path was a calculation. I didn't look at the flowers. I didn't look at the faces of the people Sarah had smuggled onto my guest list. I kept my eyes locked on Leo. He stood at the end of that long, floral-lined gauntlet, a charcoal gray silhouette against the bright afternoon sky. He was my North Star, the only thing in this garden that wasn't for sale. As I drew closer, the hard hit I'd prepared for began to pulse in my throat. I could see my father, Richard, standing on the elevated platform. He wasn't waiting to give me away. He was already positioned behind the podium, clutching the microphone as if it were a life preserver. My mother, Sarah, stood exactly 3 feet to his right, her posture regal, her eyes scanning the crowd like a general reviewing her troops. And then there were the men in the dark suits behind her. They weren't family. They weren't friends. They were the physical manifestation of the security Sarah thought she needed to enforce her will. I reached the altar and took Leo's hand. His fingers were warm, steady, and grounded. He leaned in, his voice a ghost of a whisper that only I could hear. The structure is set, Elle. Let them try to shake it. I squeezed his hand back, and then I turned to face my parents. The string quartet trailed off into a haunting, expectant silence. The only sound left was the distant chime of wind in the trees and the heavy, rhythmic thud of my own heart. The officiant stepped forward to speak, but before she could utter the first word of the liturgy, my mother's hand shot out. It was a sharp, commanding gesture that cut the air. "Wait," Sarah said. Her voice wasn't a scream, it was something far more terrifying. It was the calm, practiced tone of a woman who believes she is performing a mercy. She took the microphone from my father's trembling hand. "Before we proceed with a union that cannot be undone, there is a truth that this room needs to hear. A mother's job is to protect her children, even when they are too blinded by love to protect themselves." A collective gasp rippled through the rows. I saw my maid of honor, Rachel, shift her weight behind me, her hand tightening around the white satin clutch that held my counter-evidence. In the third row, Julian Whitmore leaned forward, his face a mask of feigned concern, while his mother, Carol, straightened her pearls. The trap was sprung. Sarah wasn't just stopping a wedding, she was launching a public execution of Leo's character, and she was doing it in front of every professional contact, friend, and family member I had ever known. My father stepped to the microphone next. He looked like a man being led to the gallows. He didn't look at me. He looked at the yellow legal pad in his hands, the script Sarah had written for him. He cleared his throat, the sound amplified and echoing off the stone walls of the estate. "Elena," he began, his voice cracking on my name. We have uncovered information. Financial records. Debts. Secrets that Leo has kept from you. As your father, I cannot stand here and watch you tether your life to a man who is built on a foundation of lies. We have the documents. We have the proof that this man is not who he says he is." He held up a sheaf of papers. I knew exactly what they were: manufactured or misinterpreted credit reports, debt tallies Sarah had likely paid a private investigator to curate. It was a masterpiece of half-truths designed to make Leo look like a fortune hunter. The crowd began to murmur, a low, rising tide of judgment. I felt the eyes of 200 people burning into the back of my dress. They were waiting for me to collapse. They were waiting for the dependable daughter to finally break. I looked at Leo. He didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He looked at my father with a profound, quiet pity. Then I looked at my mother. She was nodding, a slow, satisfied movement of her head. She looked at me, and for a second, I saw the triumph in her eyes. She thought she had won. She thought the big sister was finally back under her thumb. "Is that all?" I asked. My voice was low, but into the silence of the garden, it rang like a bell. Sarah's eyebrows shot up. "Elena, honey, you're in shock." "It's okay. We've made arrangements. Julian is here. His family is here. We can fix this. We can turn this day into a celebration of the right choice." She actually pointed at Julian. It was the most garish, desperate move of her life. The mask of the concerned mother had slipped, revealing the broker underneath. She wasn't saving me. She was trying to close the deal. I let the silence hang for a long, agonizing beat. I let the guests see her pointed finger. I let them see Julian's smug, waiting face. And then, I let go of Leo's hand, not to leave him, but to go to work. I turned to Rachel and held out my hand. Without a word, she placed the white satin clutch into my palm. I'm a litigation paralegal, Mom, I said, stepping toward the podium. I spend my life in discovery. Did you really think you could bring a scripted lie to my wedding and expect me not to have the rebuttal ready? I reached into the bag and pulled out the first set of documents. I didn't look at the crowd, I looked directly at the men in the dark suits. I recognized them now, not process servers, but witnesses Sarah had hired to lend an air of authority to her claims. Exhibit A, I said, my voice projecting with the clarity I used in the courtroom. Leo's actual, verified financial disclosure. 0 debt. A perfect credit score. And a structural engineering firm that has him on track for partnership by the end of the year. I handed the paper to my father. He took it automatically, his eyes widening as he saw the bank stamps and the official seals. Then, I pulled out the second set of papers, the ones that felt like they were vibrating with the heat of the betrayal they contained. But more importantly, I continued, I'd like to discuss the $40,000. The garden went deathly quiet. I saw Carol Whitmore's face go from pale to ashen. Sarah tried to reach for the microphone, but I stepped back, keeping it firmly in my grip. In March, $25,000 was transferred from Carol Whitmore to Sarah. In August, another $15,000. The memo on both transfers was wedding arrangement. My mother didn't find proof of Leo's failures. She bought a script. She accepted $40,000 to ensure that I would marry Julian Whitmore, a man whose own history includes 3 bankruptcies and a settled reckless driving charge, all of which I have documented right here. I held up the Venmo printouts. I held up the bankruptcy filings. The murmur of the crowd turned into a roar of shock. I saw my sister, Mia, lower her camera. The red light was still pulsing, but her hand was shaking so hard the frame must have been a blur. She looked at our mother, and for the first time in her life, she looked truly terrified of the woman she had spent her life imitating. Sarah's face began to fracture. The regal, controlled mask was gone, replaced by a raw, ugly desperation. It was for you. I did it for the family. You don't understand the pressure, Elena. You don't understand what it's like to try and keep this all together. I understand perfectly, I said. I've been the one keeping it together for 32 years while you used me as a utility. But today, the transaction is over. I turned to my father. He was staring at the Venmo receipts, his face a shade of gray I'd never seen on a living person. He looked at Sarah, then at me, then at the papers. Richard, Sarah hissed, reaching for his arm. Don't listen to her. She's being hysterical. She's trying to ruin everything. My father didn't pull away. He did something worse. He simply let go of the podium. He let the yellow legal pad fall to the grass, where it was caught by a stray gust of wind and tumbled toward the edge of the platform. He looked at the woman he had spent 3 decades listening to, and for the first time, he saw the hollow space where her heart should have been. He looked at me, his eyes wet with a sudden, devastating clarity. I didn't know, he whispered. Elena, I swear. I thought I was protecting you. Then protect me now, I said. My father turned back to the crowd. He took a breath that seemed to fill his entire frame, and he didn't use the microphone. He used the voice of a man who was finally standing on his own feet. This wedding will proceed, he announced. And anyone who is here as part of a transaction can find the exit immediately. He looked directly at row 3. Julian didn't wait for a second invitation. He stood up, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and humiliation, and stormed toward the gate. Carol followed him, her heels clicking frantically on the stone path. The men in the dark suits vanished into the shadows of the hedges. But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. Sarah was still standing on that platform, her hands clenched into fists, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She looked at the guests who were now looking at her with a mixture of pity and disgust. She looked at Mia, who had finally turned her camera off. And then she looked at me. "You think you've won?" she whispered, the microphone picking up the jagged edge of her voice. "You think you can just cut me out and be happy? I made you, Elena. Without me, you're nothing but a function. You'll see. When the world gets hard, you'll realize that $40,000 was a bargain for the protection I gave you." She stepped off the platform, her silk dress rustling like dry leaves, and walked toward the bridal suite. She didn't look back. The officiant looked at Leo and me. The garden was still reeling, the air thick with the scent of a collapsed dynasty. "Shall we?" she asked tentatively. Leo took my hand again. He brought it to his lips and kissed my knuckles. "Wait," I said. "There's one more thing." I signaled to Rachel. She reached into the clutch and pulled out the thumb drive. She walked over to the sound technician, who was standing by the stone archway, looking as stunned as everyone else. I looked at the guests. "My mother mentioned protection," I said into the microphone. "But I think we should all hear what she considers protection when she thinks no one is listening." The speakers crackled to life. It wasn't music. It was a recording from the night of the rehearsal dinner, a recording Leo had captured on his phone when Sarah had pulled him aside into the kitchen, thinking the house was empty. "You're a smart man, Leo," Sarah's voice boomed through the garden, cold and predatory. "You know a failing structure when you see one. Elena is the foundation of this family. If you take her away, the whole thing falls. So, I'm going to make this very simple for you. Take the $10,000 I'm offering you now to walk away, or I will make sure that by the time you reach that altar, she hates the very sound of your name." The recording cut out. The garden was so quiet you could hear the insects in the grass. I looked at the bridal suite where my mother had retreated. I knew she could hear it. I knew she was standing behind those closed doors, realizing that the dependable daughter hadn't just conducted discovery. I had conducted an execution. Leo looked at me, his eyes shining with a mixture of pride and something that looked like grief. "Are you ready?" he asked. "I've been ready for years," I said. We turned to the officiant, but before she could speak, the doors to the bridal suite flew open. It wasn't my mother. It was my sister, Mia. She was holding her phone again, but this time, she wasn't recording. She was staring at a new notification, her face devoid of all color. She choked out, her voice barely audible. "You need to see this. Mom's phone, it just went live on her Instagram. But she's not the one holding it." I looked at Mia, and for the first time in our lives, the resentment between us vanished, replaced by a cold, shared dread. My sister, the girl who lived for the lens, was looking at her screen as if it were a portal to hell. She stepped toward the altar, her hand trembling as she turned the phone toward me. The live stream was active. The view was shaky, moving through the interior of the bridal suite. Sarah wasn't the one holding the phone. The camera was being held by a hand in a navy blazer. Julian. He hadn't left the estate. He had doubled back, slipping into the house while the garden was reeling. The audio was a jagged mess of muffled sobbing and sharp, desperate whispers. My mother was slumped in the velvet chair, her face buried in her hands. Julian's voice came through the speakers, low and venomous. "You promised me this was a sure thing, Janet," Julian hissed, the camera tilting as he paced. "My mother put $40,000 into your pocket because you said Elena was manageable. You said she was the glue. Do you have any idea what happens to my family's credit if this merger doesn't happen? Do you have any idea what I lose?" The 200 people in the garden were staring at the large monitors we had set up for a photo slideshow. Confused and paralyzed, the technician had accidentally mirrored Mia's feed to the big screens. My mother's breakdown was now being broadcast in high definition. We watched as Sarah looked up, her eyes wild. "Put that away, Julian," she gasped, reaching for the device. "We can still fix it. I'll talk to her. I'll make her see. You'll make her see what? Julian laughed, a jagged, ugly sound. You just got dismantled by your own daughter in front of the whole town. You're not a mayor anymore, Janet. You're a liability. And I'm not leaving here empty-handed. Leo stepped forward, his hand dropping from mine. He didn't look at the screen, he looked at the house. He's still in there, Leo said, his voice a low rumble. He's cornered her. But before Leo could move, I caught his arm. My eyes were fixed on the screen. I saw something Julian didn't see. Behind him, in the reflection of the vanity mirror, the door to the suite was easing open. It was my father. Richard hadn't just stood up for himself at the altar, he had followed the rot back to its source. On the screen, we watched my father enter the frame. He didn't yell. He didn't charge. He simply walked up behind Julian and placed a heavy, calloused hand on his shoulder. Julian spun around, the camera whipping wildly, capturing a blur of white lace before the feed abruptly cut to black. The silence that followed was more deafening than the audio. 200 people sat in a garden that had become a crime scene. I stood at the altar, the lace of my wedding dress feeling like a shroud. I looked at Leo, and the realization finally crashed over me. It wasn't the betrayal. It wasn't the money. It was the fact that the man I loved was the only thing left standing in the wreckage of my old life. Reverend, I said, my voice cracking for the very first time. Finish it. Please. The ceremony that followed was a blur of survival. Leo took my hands, his grip the only thing keeping me from vibrating apart. When we said our vows, they weren't the poetic lines we'd written in our notebooks. I choose you, I whispered, looking into his eyes, not because it's easy, and not because anyone else approves. I choose you because you're the only person who ever saw the girl behind the function. And I choose you, Leo replied, his voice thick with emotion, because I know how much it cost you to stand here today. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to carry the weight alone again. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, the applause wasn't the polite clapping of a society wedding. It was a roar, a visceral sound of support from the people who had just watched a woman win her freedom. Leo kissed me, and for a fleeting second, the garden disappeared. The noise, the betrayal, the $40,000, it all fell away. But as we turned to walk back down the aisle, the reality of the aftermath was waiting. My father was standing at the back of the garden, near the gate. He was alone. He looked aged, but he also looked awake. He didn't come to congratulate us. He just gave me a single, somber nod and pointed toward the driveway. Sarah was being led to a car by Mia. My sister wasn't filming anymore. She was holding our mother's arm, her face set in a mask of grim responsibility. They didn't look back. The mayor was leaving her town in disgrace, and the golden child was finally having to do the heavy lifting. We didn't go to the reception immediately. Leo and I sat in the back of the getaway car for 20 minutes. I put my head on his shoulder and finally cried. Not the pretty, cinematic tears my sister would have wanted, but the jagged, ugly sobs of a woman who had just had to burn her childhood home down to keep from freezing to death. What now? I asked, wiping my face with a silk napkin. Now, Leo said, we go to the party. We thank the people who stayed. And tomorrow, we change our locks. The reception was a surreal experience. The Whitmore tables were empty, 40 chairs, 40 untouched plates of seared salmon, 40 ghosts. But the rest of the room was alive. My mentor, Hector Vega, stood up for the first toast. He didn't mention the drama. He just looked at me and said, in the law, we look for the truth. In life, we look for partners who can handle it. To Elena and Leo. We danced. We ate. I saw my father sitting in the far corner, sipping a ginger ale and watching the room with the quiet detachment of a man who had finally retired from a job he hated. But as the night began to wind down, a waiter approached me with a small silver tray. On it was a single, crumpled piece of yellow legal paper. A woman dropped this off at the valet stand, the waiter said, looking uncomfortable. She said you'd know what it was. I unfolded the paper. It was the script my mother had written for my father. But across the back of it, in Sarah's elegant, terrifyingly precise handwriting, was a new message. The 40,000 was just the beginning, Elena. Carol Whitmore doesn't take losses well. And neither do I. Check the mail on Monday. I felt the blood drain from my extremities. I looked at Leo, who was laughing across the room. I looked at the paper in my hand. The wedding arrangement wasn't a closed case. It was a contract. And according to my mother, I was still the collateral. I looked toward the dark driveway, the feeling of being watched creeping up my spine. My phone buzzed in my clutch. A new message from an unknown number. Just a video file. I pressed play, and my heart stopped. It was a bird's-eye view of our new townhouse, taken from a drone, circling the bedroom window where Leo and I were supposed to sleep that night. The voiceover on the video was a mechanical, AI-generated chill. The foundation is only as strong as the secrets buried beneath it. Ask Leo about the bridge in Knoxville. Ask him why he really left Tennessee. I looked at my husband, the man I had just pledged my life to. And the room began to spin. Every structural engineer has a failure point. I just didn't realize my mother had found his. I leaned against the table, the yellow paper crinkling in my hand. I needed to find Leo. I needed to ask him. But as I turned, I saw him standing by the exit, talking to a man in a navy blazer I hadn't seen all night. It wasn't Julian. It was someone older. Someone who looked exactly like the man from the bridge failure news clippings I'd seen years ago. Leo looked at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, his eyes weren't steady. They were full of terror. He didn't say a word. He just turned and walked out the door with the stranger, leaving me standing in the center of the room, still wearing my white dress, surrounded by 40 empty chairs. The silence of the reception hall was no longer the silence of a celebration, it was the silence of an abyss. I stood in the center of the dance floor, the fairy lights above me looking like cold, distant stars. My husband had just walked into the night with a ghost from a past I didn't know existed. The yellow paper in my hand felt like it was burning my skin. I looked down at the video on my phone, the drone footage of our home still looping. I didn't panic. I am a litigation paralegal. I am trained to look at a catastrophe and find the filing system. I walked to the family table, sat in one of the 40 empty chairs, and opened my laptop. The discovery binder wasn't finished. I had investigated the Whitmores and my mother, but I had committed the cardinal sin of my profession. I had assumed my own client was clean. I typed Knoxville Bridge Project into the search bar. I added Leo's full name and the year he moved to Seattle. For 3 years, I believed he left Tennessee for a better opportunity. In my world, fresh start is usually a euphemism for fleeing a subpoena. The results hit the screen like a volley of gunfire. There had been a partial collapse during a seismic retrofitting in 2021. No one was killed, but the investigation had been brutal. The lead engineer on record wasn't Leo. It was the man I had just seen him leave with, Thomas Vance, his former mentor. But as I scrolled through the transcripts, I saw Leo's name in the margins. He hadn't been the one who signed off on the faulty steel, he had been the one who blew the whistle. He was the reason Thomas Vance had lost his license and spent 2 years in federal prison. The man in the navy blazer wasn't a co-conspirator. He was a predator. And my mother had invited him here. I realized then that Sarah's plan was never just to stop the wedding. It was to ensure that if she couldn't own me, she would make sure I owned nothing. She had reached into the dark corners of Leo's life and pulled out the one man who had a reason to destroy him. She didn't care about the truth of the bridge, she only cared that the scandal would be enough to ruin our reputation, our careers, and our marriage. I stood up, grabbing my white satin clutch. I didn't need a witness, and I didn't need a script. I needed to find my husband before Thomas Vance convinced him that the only way to save me was to disappear. I found them in the parking lot, near the edge of the dark woods. The headlights of Vance's car were on, cutting two harsh tunnels into the mist. Leo was standing in the glare, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his head bowed. Vance was leaning against the hood, a cigarette dangling from his lip, his voice a low hum of manipulation. "She's a highflyer, Leo," Vance was saying as I approached. "A senior paralegal at Brennan and Associates. You think they'll keep her on when the headlines hit? Wife of whistleblower linked to negligence suit. You're a lead weight, kid. Your mother-in-law was right. You're a liability." "He's not a liability," I said, stepping into the light. My voice was cold, professional, and loud enough to crack the silence. "He's a witness. And you're in violation of your parole conditions regarding contact with former colleagues, aren't you, Mr. Vance?" Vance spun around, squinting against the darkness. Leo looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and hope. "Elena, go back inside," Leo gasped. "You don't know what." "I know exactly what happened in Knoxville, Leo," I said, walking right up to Vance. I held up my phone, showing the open tab of his parole registry. "I also know that my mother paid for your plane ticket here. Did she tell you that accepting money to harass a witness is a felony in this state? Or did she just tell you that I was manageable?" Vance's face contorted. He looked at the phone, then at the house, then back at me. He realized in that moment what my mother hadn't: I don't just find the truth. I weaponize it. "This is a family matter, lady," Vance spat, though his bravado was leaking. "No," I replied. "This is a legal matter. And if you're not out of this driveway in 60 seconds, I'm calling the senior partner at my firm, who happens to be sitting inside at table 4, and he's going to make sure your next fresh start is in a cell." Vance didn't wait. He didn't even look at Leo. He scrambled into his car, the tires screaming on the gravel as he tore out of the lot. The silence that followed was different. It was the silence of two people realizing the war was finally over. Leo looked at me, his shoulders finally dropping. He looked like he was about to collapse. "I was going to tell you, Elle," he whispered. I wanted one day where I wasn't the guy from the bridge collapse. I wanted to be the guy who deserved you." I walked over and put my hands on his face. The lace of my sleeves was stained with dust, and my veil was somewhere back on the dance floor. "You are the guy who deserved me because you told the truth when it cost you everything. That's the only foundation I care about." We stood there for a long time, held together by nothing but our own strength. The big sister was gone. The function was gone. There was just Elena and Leo. 6 months have passed since that night. The townhouse is quiet, the guest room we're renovating smells like fresh cedar and hope. I got the promotion to senior paralegal, and Leo's firm did their own discovery on the Knoxville project. They didn't fire him. They promoted him. They realized that an engineer who refuses to lie about a structural flaw is the only kind of engineer worth having. My mother has not called. My sister has deleted every digital trace of the life she used to pretend she had. My father calls me every Thursday. We talk about the weather, and his garden, and the way the light hits the sound in the evening. We don't talk about Sarah. We don't talk about the $40,000. But we talk. I kept the 2 letters. They sit in the back of my desk drawer, right next to the wedding arrangement files. Sometimes, when a case gets hard, I take them out and look at them. I look at my mother's careful cursive and my father's blocky print. I look at them to remind myself that my life is not a transaction. My worth is not a number on a Venmo memo. And love isn't something you buy or broker, it's something you build, stone by stone, truth by truth, until it's strong enough to withstand even the most calculated storm. People still ask me if I regret what I did at the altar. They ask if I feel bad about humiliating my mother in front of 200 people. I always give them the same answer. I didn't humiliate her. I just gave her the one thing she always insisted on, the narrative. It just happened to be the true one. I am Elena Thompson. I am no longer the dependable one for people who don't care if I break. I am the woman who stood still when the world tried to push her over. And as I look at Leo across the dinner table tonight, I realize that the best part of our story isn't the reveal, or the drama, or the $40,000. It's the fact that tomorrow, we get to wake up and do it all again, for free.
Have a story like this? Send it to us, and we'll share it with the world. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more true family drama. Thanks for watching.